Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the EU Mission lunchtime seminar on presenting the MIP4ADAPT's guidelines to assess climate change risks and vulnerability, and do-it-yourself manual that has been developed. My name is Thomas Dvorak. I'm part of the mission implementation team. And the mission on adaptation, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a European Commission initiative that aims to support regions, in particular in adaptation to climate change, and is providing a lot of trainings and support activities. And this kind of lunchtime seminar is one of the support activities we provide. I'm happy that we have Claire with us, Claire Maguire, which will present the tool and what a vulnerability assessment is in the next 1.5 hours. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat. I will then pass them to the speakers. And in order to get a bit of feedback from you, we have prepared a couple of Slido sessions where we will ask you some questions. So, yeah, we are coming to that in a minute. The main question that is interesting us at the end of the presentation is, do you think that the tool that has been developed is useful and will help you in your work? Having said that, Maria, can you jump please to the Slido so we know a bit better who is around? So you just use your mobile phone to either screen this QR code, or I assume Michi has put the link also into the chat. Yes, it is. So you can click here on the link and then please ask the question, which kind of organization do you represent? Okay, so most of the people are from the regional local level charter signatories. We have quite some business colleagues here. Scientific community is growing. And it's looking good now. We are not having all who are at the meeting in the voting. By the way, for those of you who are not being available to be with us all the time, or have a colleague who wants to see the meeting afterwards, there will be a recording. It will be put to on YouTube, and we are going to share the link on YouTube with the thank you email, so that those of you who have registered can spread that link then to other colleagues as well. Okay, second question, please, Maria. So most of the people are from regional authority. And in order to get your experience and understand to which extent you have already carried out the climate and risk assessment, we asked the question, have you done it or not? So the first almost 10 people say no, then a few have done it internally, and some are doing it outsourced, but still the majority is with no. Still, so at least, Claire, the good thing is there will be a lot of people who have not done the work before, and I assume based on this, the interest will be high. So thanks, Claire, for having time today and starting your presentation now. So I think Maria has to give you the rights on the screen.
I should be sharing now, but please do let me know if that's caused any problems for anyone.
Yes, this works perfect.
Oh, good, great. Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for joining today, and thank you, Thomas, for that introduction. My name is Claire Maguire. I'm an adaptation consultant with Ricardo, supporting on the technical assistance through the mission implementation platform. I've conducted a number of climate vulnerability and risk assessments across Europe, in the Middle East, and Africa, all aligned with the framework that we'll be discussing today. The intent of this session is to walk you through the climate risk assessment template that has been made available and essentially demonstrate a bit of a how-to. I understand that some of you may have joined a session last week, which touched on some of the same topics. And yeah, some of the concepts or information shared today may be repeated. So apologies for that in advance, but hopefully it just gives us a chance to kind of get closer to the concepts and really get to know what it means. But to go through this, I'll begin with a brief introduction to what exactly a CRA, climate risk assessment, is, where it sits within the RAS, the Regional Adaptation Support Tool, why this matters, and how the kind of framework that we'll be talking about translates into some actions or steps which have been formulated into the CRA guidance and template. I'll give a very quick introduction to the template and actions within the template. For the sake of time, because I think what's going to be most helpful is getting to the demonstration of the tool itself, I'll go through and provide a high-level overview of each of the actions. But if you have any questions, either bear with, we'll go through it more closely. But if there are anything still remaining, then we can gain that feedback through Slido or get in contact with us after. It's important to highlight that all of the information that I'll discuss today, including like definitions, instructions, recommendations, tips, sources, etc., are located within the Excel template itself and within supporting guidance documents. So if you feel that I've moved too quickly or that you've missed something, then yeah, I'd welcome you to engage with those materials because everything has been taken or is contained within those. So what exactly is a CRA? The diagram on the left has been developed by the IPCC under AR6 to demonstrate the kind of components that constitute or like contribute to climate risk. This includes the climate-related hazard itself, so that could be a slow onset change such as temperature, precipitation, or sea level rise, or it could be an extreme event such as flooding or wildfires or severe storms. Moving around, we then have the vulnerability to those particular hazards. And again, moving around, we have the physical exposure to those hazards. And considering all of this, we might have potential response mechanisms or measures that we put in place to change the nature of that risk. So all of these kind of feedback within each other to determine the kind of nature and level of risk that we might experience as a person or a household, a community, a region in general. A climate risk assessment is essentially creating a framework and process that helps us understand the kind of embedded physical and socioeconomic vulnerabilities and resulting risks posed by climate change. Because of the forward-facing nature of adaptation and kind of adaptation planning, it focuses on kind of future changes. These might include inventory of potential impact, who is impacted, to what extent and how, the likelihood of that impact occurring, and the potential resulting consequences. It's also important to note that because of the kind of dynamic and contextual and complex nature of all of these components, and their interactions, it's emphasised, you know, by all practitioners that stakeholders should be called upon for input and contribution, review, validation of a CRA and of the components of a CRA. It's really critical as this ensures relevance, credibility and legitimacy to the process and the outcomes of the process, all of which contribute to that long-term buy-in and long-term sustained action that we're looking for. So in the context of adaptation planning, where does a CRA sit? A CRA, you might know, is one of the very first steps required within the adaptation planning cycle. It provides the evidence base kind of from which all of the other steps in the cycle are built. So it's really important that the kind of available time and resources and effort are put into that step 2 to set up the rest of the steps following. This is kind of the most fundamental benefit to conducting a CRA, is to identify and select the adaptation options based on the results of what the CRA is telling us, specifically in regards to the specific vulnerabilities or the specific exposure and impacts and likelihoods. By developing a robust, systematic and comprehensive CRA, you can identify measures or options that are importantly measurable and precise according to the details of the results. This provides a transparent and detailed blueprint for the implementation and monitoring of and evaluation of options. And as you might be aware, that this system feeds back on itself. So the level of detail that we can gain in that step 2 assessment of vulnerabilities and risks allows us to be more detailed about the options that we can identify, be more detailed about the implementation details that are required to make sure that they happen and they have the resources and are done correctly, and also provides the detail for that monitoring and evaluation to make sure that we are gaining those sustained benefits. As I've said, it's kind of by investing in this early step, and that could be, you know, it's not necessarily financial, it could be in terms of time or resource or effort, but by putting that investment in, that commitment, then you can really reap the benefits through the other steps of the cycle. Now, as previously mentioned, climate risk is the result of kind of the interactions between these key components. And these components provide the basis for a CRA framework, and as I've said, therefore, the template that has been developed. It's useful to kind of dig in a little bit closer to what these components are as they set up the foundation of the template and help us understand what we're looking at a bit better. So firstly, hazards, as we mentioned, climate-related hazards being kind of the physical changes or events or parameters characterised as extreme weather-related events or slow onset climate changes. These may be negative or positive, depending on the interaction with kind of people, ecosystems, species, assets, etc. Vulnerability is the tendency of these receptors to be affected by the climate-related hazards. And we can understand vulnerability a bit closer through 2 concepts. The first being sensitivity, which is the degree to which a receptor is affected by change. To put this into kind of practical sense, because this is often the hardest one to kind of materialize in our heads. I might be sensitive to changes in heat as a human, whereas coastal ecosystems and fisheries could be sensitive to changes in acidity or salinity. It's really about that relationship between the receptor itself and the potential changes. The second way that we can understand vulnerability is through adaptive capacity, this being the ability to adjust or take advantage or respond to change and consequences. I'll go into this a little bit closer in detail later to provide some examples. The next one we're looking at is exposure. So this describes the presence of systems, assets, people in areas that could be affected by a particular climate-related hazard. The kind of easiest one to get your head around is any kind of floodplains or flood risk zones. That is the presence of assets or communities in an area which could potentially be affected by a climate-related hazard. And finally, response, which is as I've said, the actions or measures that we implement that can reduce risk or take advantage of opportunities. And critically, they do this by affecting the other components within this, within these relationships. So it's that's the importance of the CRA and the CRA outputs, is that we get a closer look at the climate-related hazards, at the components, at the concepts of vulnerability, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, exposure, because by changing these elements, we can therefore have a response that addresses the core causes of climate risk and reducing our risk. So based on the IPCC's definitions within AR6, we can sequentially align these terms to form a systematic kind of stepwise framework approach for understanding and assessing climate risk and opportunities. This approach can be easily broken down into actions to help us create a plan for completing the assessment of climate risk. And these actions themselves, shown on kind of the left-hand side of the screen, form the basis and the structure of the CRA guidance template. I'll briefly, as briefly as I can, walk through these actions before moving to the demonstration, just so we have a bit of an understanding of what we're looking at. And then we'll see how they apply within a kind of workbook environment, and I'll provide a couple practical examples. So just as a bit of an introduction to the CRA guide and template, firstly, there are a couple of things to note. So on the left here, I've extracted the names of the tabs within the Excel template. And just to demonstrate, I've done this just to demonstrate two things. Firstly, that the Excel itself contains information tabs and input tabs. Those highlighted in bold are input tabs, and the rest of them contain kind of information and links to helpful sources, or you know, guidance and advice on how to complete it, relating to the particular actions. The second thing is just to demonstrate that it's really essential that you complete the tabs in order. Because one component helps you understand the next, and the information you'll engage with in one component will support your ability to understand the next. And B, because there are functions within the templates that rely on the completion of the previous tab. So it's just to encourage you to kind of follow the process, you know, go with it. It'll make sense, hopefully more after today, but definitely once you engage directly with the Excel itself. While I do encourage you to engage with the supporting information provided in the Excel and in the kind of guidance supporting documents, this is by no means restrictive. If you have the capacity and the time. You can use tools and information beyond what is provided. It's by no means to limit you, but it's just recommendations and a good starting point just to get you going. And on the other hand, if you do have limited time, resource, or capacity to complete the CRA, then within the template itself, shortcuts are provided so that you can still identify the basics of the CRA, which can act as a first draft, which can be updated or reviewed at a later time. But those have been provided throughout just to make sure that you are able to kind of get on that journey in the first place. So beginning with an overview of action 1, which is preparing the ground. The first step basically helps you prepare for conducting a CRA by considering, firstly, the scope of the assessment, by thinking on the boundary and the responsibility of your regional authority. You can ask the questions about who is under that responsibility, what are the characteristics of ecosystems within that boundary, what are the key economic, social and cultural assets within that region, and identifying what are the key public services that should be considered. The second consideration is the methodological approach. So we would recommend, and it is recommended, that you align the methodology that you choose with existing risk management processes or your national climate risk assessment, if there is one available. This will help with the identification of future support or vertical mainstreaming, and collaboration with different governing bodies or governance levels, or with other regions itself. It'll also kind of help create a sectoral approach, which is recommended, meaning that the scope or the kind of grouping of the assessment is considered at the sector level. This can further kind of help with that decision making and help identify decision makers and stakeholders, and really sets you up for that collaboration that is needed for the components of the CRA itself, but also needed for sustaining long-term action. As previously mentioned, it's really critical that stakeholders are involved to ensure that relevance, credibility and legitimacy. And just to point you towards that, a DIY manual has been developed through the support for the platform, kind of under the title of the Stakeholder and Citizen Engagement in Climate Adaptation. It's a great one-stop shop to get you going on that engagement path. And I'd highly recommend that you engage with that manual during this action 1 before you complete the CRA. Doesn't mean that you can't look at it later on if you've already started the process, but it's a really good place to start from to understand kind of what you can do. So action 2 focuses on the assessment of vulnerability. Under the template, the Excel template, this includes the identification and rating of adaptive capacity and sensitivity against the receptors. This is why it's really critical early on in that step 1 or action 1 to consider the sectors, receptors and hazards that you might look at under the scope of the assessment, so that it all can be aligned and that you're prepared. What this process looks like is really just thinking on the components and describing the receptors' experience of them. So, for example, for adaptive capacity, we can kind of group it by these 4 capacity categories. So being organizational, technical, financial, and ecosystem. And just to give you some examples, this might look like human resources or technological resilience, the mobilization of funds, and ecological resilience. By describing each of those components, you can get a better sense of that overall, what does the adaptive capacity look like for that receptor or within that sector or for that community. For sensitivity, this may look like considering the sensitivity of crops to climate-related hazards, for example, temperature and precipitation. But it's thinking about that relationship itself, a key asset within the agricultural sector being the particular crops, and trying to understand the relationship that those crops have with particular hazards. You can go to different levels of detail with this depending on the information you have available or depending on the stakeholders that you might have engaged. But a really high level version is just that, okay, well, we do know that crops are sensitive to changes in temperature or precipitation. The next level would be kind of differentiating those crops or differentiating those kind of agricultural types. Some might respond better to dry conditions versus wetter, etc. And then the kind of most detailed level that you could possibly you could go to with the right technical understanding is which particular crops, which particular grains, and then you can start to build that detail towards the actions that you would then select, being we can select particular crops or that are appropriate for our region, that are more resistant to the changes that we might be seeing under our future scenarios. Once you have the description and once you've kind of described those relationships there, you can assign a rating to these from 1 to 5, just to give an understanding of the most sensitive to the least sensitive, or the highest level of adaptive capacity to the lowest. I do appreciate the boxes on the screen are quite small, so you might not be able to see them in detail, but they basically describe each level of the ratings. Both have been taken from the CRA template, so all that information is in there. It's just kind of give you a bit of an introduction to that concept. It's important to say that if you don't have time or resources or capacity to complete a full assessment, if you're really struggling, you may prefer to identify and rate climate vulnerability at a more high level. So instead of engaging with sensitivity and adaptive capacity, this is one of the ways that you can pull back and do that first pass assessment, is by just looking at vulnerability and identifying high level vulnerabilities and kind of providing a rating of that, high level vulnerability against the receptors or the sectors you might have identified. It will generate a less detailed assessment and result in less information for the identification and selection of adaptation options. That's not a, that's not a complete limit to the process. You can still move forward, but it's just something to bear in mind, that the more detailed you go through the CRA, that process, the easier and the more detail you're going to have for selecting appropriate actions, which can help get that kind of buy-in from particular implementing organizations or responsible agents. So once rated, and this slide is just to demonstrate to you kind of what this means, but once rated, the template, the Excel template, will automatically interact ratings of sensitivity and adaptive capacity to generate a vulnerability rating. And as you can see, the kind of the higher the sensitivity and the lower the adaptive capacity, being I have a very strong relationship to this hazard, but I don't have the resources or capacity to change that relationship or to change my circumstances, then I'm going to be highly vulnerable to that particular outcome. So after exploring vulnerability, we can move to the understanding of potential future scenarios. This really to determine the extent to which climate-related hazards are projected to change under different potential futures. The steps kind of recommended to do this are to select the future scenario that you wish to cover, to list hazards identified under the vulnerability assessment, and then identify data for those hazards including the unit of measurement and the particular projection for that climate hazard. The timeframes that you would like to explore them at, and the scenarios themselves. There are some key recommendations included in the template that I've extracted here, just to help us kind of along this journey, because there's a lot of kind of data requirements. The first is to align with align the scenarios with the IPCC AR6 or Cordex, and both of which are available through the Copernicus Climate Data Store, which is one of the most kind of recommended sources. The second is to liaise with national meteorological services for consistency with national adaptation planning. And finally, really importantly, is to consider uncertainty. You know, we can't predict the future. We can only project it based on our best available knowledge and our best available models. To apply this within our process, if we were to explore just one future scenario, we are embedding a kind of commitment in the actions that we would then identify to a future which may or may not happen, and there may be more or less uncertainty associated with it. But if, you know, we recommend that if you explore a minimum 2 scenarios, then you have an understanding of the range of potential futures that might occur, and help give the context to the actions that you can identify. Gathering this information will help you complete the Action 3 template. I've snipped an excerpt here just at the bottom to give you a visual on that, and I'll go through this when we get to the demonstration, but it's just to highlight that in this, you know, within each of these boxes, we have the hazards, the unit of measurement, and then under 3 different time frames, we've looked at 2 different scenarios. So in this case, I've chosen SSP2 and SSP5, and the value that I've input under the particular scenario for the particular time frame, I have just simply averaged across the time frame here. That is not the only way that you can do it. You can do it in a more granular format if you wish, but this is just the structure of the template, and it's kind of the easiest, most accessible way of accessing that information. So action 4, this is when we've understood our vulnerability, and then we've understood what potential futures we may be facing under those against those particular climate-related hazards. We then need to understand how exposed we are to those hazards, and we can kind of understand our exposure through some example indicators. And this paper, the paper that these have been taken from, is linked in the Excel. So, for example, the percentage of population exposed to extreme heat, or the percentage of population located in areas at risk of burning from wildfire, the percentage of population exposed to violent storms, or the percentage of cropland exposed to a certain number of days of precipitation being above the 99th percentile. These are just some examples, and there are more available, and you can kind of you can tailor the indicators that you would like to look at to your particular receptor or particular sector. But it's understanding, it's trying to assign an evaluation of how, you know, the presence of those receptors in an area where a hazard will occur. The exposure is also important to note, may change over timeframes and scenarios. So under a future where we have increasing heavy precipitation, or expanding areas of heavy precipitation, or alternately expanding areas of aridity, that's going to change over different timeframes and under the different scenarios. So it's kind of understanding what the nature of the receptor is in relationship to their climate hazard, what the nature of the climate hazard is and how it might change, and using those projections as the basis for understanding those kind of potential futures. Again, we kind of, within the Excel template, we can describe that relationship with exposure, and that description will help us assign a rating of exposure. And again, I've included the very small box here with the definition of those ratings, but those are available within the Excel template. Once you have those ratings, the Excel will again automatically interact the ratings of exposure and vulnerability to generate a rating of impact. To qualitatively understand this, so if I have a predisposition for harm from particular climate hazards, I am highly vulnerable. If I'm highly vulnerable for the characteristics of being a person and being sensitive to certain elements, if I'm then located in an area where those climate-related hazards will occur, that will result in an impact. And the magnitude of that impact can be understood through the level of vulnerability at which I experience and the level of exposure that I'm at. And then we generate these kind of overall impact ratings from 1 to 5. Finally, under action 5, we explore risk. So to determine risk, we must understand the likelihood of those future potential climate-related impacts based on the trajectory of climate-related hazards. By exploring, kind of, you can see I've highlighted them in the bottom left-hand corner here. By exploring the trajectory of the hazards over time frames and scenarios, we can understand how likelihood might be under the different ones and how they might progress over the different scenarios and time frames. It's also important to consider at that point, again, like, how does this affect or change the exposure level? As I've said, some particular hazards might change in their nature, they might change in their magnitude, or they might change in their location. And engaging between these two informations, you can get a better sense of that. Once you've kind of reviewed against one against the other, you can complete the same process as before, a rating of likelihood. Once you have rated that within the template, it will automatically generate a overall risk rating. So by interacting the likelihood rating and the impact, so if we describe this again, I have a vulnerability to particular hazards. I'm located in areas which they will occur, which will result, if they do occur, it will result in an impact. How likely that impact is will determine my level of risk. And the final action, just to briefly touch on, it's not a action which is required input, but it's kind of, I've mentioned earlier on in the process, and just to caveat it across all results as well, about understanding, considering, and most importantly, communicating uncertainty. This might include kind of considering the uncertainties related to the data and knowledge used in each assessment, each element of the assessment. Consider uncertainties relating to timescales and scenarios. So again, as I've said, we cannot predict the future. We can only project it based on our kind of best understanding of current science and best ability through current climate modelling capabilities. It's really important that we are transparent about the uncertainty associated with the outputs of a CRA. It is not a tool which it's not a tool we are using to predict the future, and therefore we must integrate that and kind of embrace that uncertainty within the process of action identification and implementation. So we're not betting on one particular future to happen. We're not betting on that a flood will definitely occur in that particular area in the year 2038. We can't do that. But what we can do is understand the range of uncertainties, understand the range of futures, embrace those, and make decisions, make our best possible decisions based on the potential futures that we might face. By doing this, we are creating that adaptation to a future of continuing climate change. We are preparing ourselves for a very uncertain future, regardless of the scenario that we might be headed on. Okay, so I've spoken quite a lot through that presentation, but I just will now move to the Excel template itself. I'll kind of go through each of the tabs and I'll pick out some of the information included in them, but just for time, we're not going to have the time to go through every single line. So as I've said, I really encourage you to, after this session, engage with the template itself and read through the different information. You can have a play around with the input tabs, just to see how things react to each other and what kind of space there is for information, but that will help you get a better sense of things. So to begin kind of our introduction to the Excel template, we have the first tab, which contains this introduction. It summarizes everything I've just said in the presentation, but it's just giving you that introduction to what is contained within the Excel. The next tab we have is includes the definitions of risk. So you can always come back to these and refer if you're struggling with a particular concept or trying to categorize a particular piece of information. It also includes the diagram of how the framework of a climate risk assessment works. So all of that which you might need to kind of make sure that you're following on the right path is here. We then move to action 1, and this tab just gives you an introduction to that. It summarizes what you will need to do under action 1. And yeah, the link to the DIY manual that was mentioned is included there. Then we'll move to action 2, which begins the kind of process towards getting towards some inputs. It summarizes all of the things that you might need to understand about climate vulnerabilities, about rating and understanding sensitivity and adaptive capacity. It gives you the definitions for the ratings of sensitivity and adaptive capacity and for vulnerability, should you choose to kind of enter at that point. So this next tab brings us to the first input tab, where you would be required to like put in information. So how I'm going to structure this is that I have included currently an example that I'll talk through briefly, and I have a secondary example that I'll go back once we've gone through the tabs. I'll go back through them again and I'll input manually a second example I've prepared so that I can walk you through the thinking around how to complete the template. So the first tab being vulnerability. So we want to know what sector we're covering, what receptor we're considering, what hazard we might be thinking about in relation to that receptor. We then have the sensitivity, and here it's the qualitative description, the space for the sensitivity rating. We then have the space for the kind of components of adaptive capacity, the rating of adaptive capacity, and finally the automatically generated rating of vulnerability. It's also obviously worth noting that all of this, the kind of instructions for each column are described in this section here, which is available across all of the tabs. So to start on the first example, I've generated this kind of just as a high level example firstly. So if we were looking at the transport sector, we might be thinking about what roads or kind of particular materials, for example, tarmac, how that might respond to a particular climate hazard. In this case, I've chosen extreme heat. We would then qualitatively describe the potential sensitivity of that receptor to that hazard. And based on that description, I can provide a rating. I then can provide kind of through information gained either through stakeholder engagement or through secondary sources, I can gain an understanding of the different types of adaptive capacity and qualitatively describe them here. So the first one we have is organizational, the technical capacity, the financial capacity, and in this case, considering tarmac, ecosystem capacity is not applicable. I would then take an understanding of these three descriptions, and then I can, with the team that I might be working with, provide a rating for adaptive capacity. And as I said, this will automatically generate the rating of vulnerability. If I go to the next tab, it's providing us this introduction again to the next action, which is the future scenarios. Again, it provides you all of those recommendations and what you should kind of look out for. It also, as I should have said for a number of the other tabs, provides these links to helpful resources, which you can kind of start the process from. It's not restrictive, but it's a good place to start. The Action 3 template is for the identification of future scenarios. So this is the space where we can input that data we were talking about climate-related hazards, including the unit of measurement and understanding under different scenarios. In this case, I've chosen two scenarios being SSP2 and SSP5. That is kind of a high ambition in terms of adaptation and mitigation scenario at the lower end, so a more favourable future, being SSP2, and SSP5 being a very fossil-fueled development-focused future, which is quite an unfavourable future. I've just chosen those two for an example to give us a range, but that decision is up to you and what kind of best suits your needs or is in alignment with your national risk assessment process. So within this, we want to know what that hazard is. We then want to include that unit of measurement and then input the values across here. I'll demonstrate with the secondary example of what that might be, but just as I think I might have mentioned or should be mentioned, is this value that I've input at the moment. I personally have taken the 2030 value to take the mid-range of the near-term future. That is purely a decision I took for ease of demonstrating purposes, but that would be kind of that would be a decision up to you essentially. The next tab we get to is for Action 4, which is impacts. Again, it's an information tab, provides everything you might need to understand how to complete Action 4 and where to look to get information about that. It also, once again, includes the ratings and the definitions of those ratings. We then move to the Action 5 information tab, and there is a reason for this I'll explain in a minute. But it's exactly the same as previous ones, information-based, and provides you the ratings. Action 4 and 5, in terms of the input tab, are grouped together, and I'll explain why in a second. So some of this information will be automatically transferred across from previous tabs, and you'll see that in the second demonstration quickly. But what this is essentially trying to understand is under the different terms and the different scenarios, we want to understand what our exposure is. So that's the kind of under Action 4, identifying impact, and what our risk is, which is Action 5 and understanding likelihood. It's easy to group these together, or it's helpful to group these together because they're both reliant on an understanding of those future trajectories, which we completed in Action 3. So within this, you have the information carried across, so the sector, receptor, the hazard, the automatically generated vulnerability rating. And then here it requires you to describe the location of that receptor. That describing the location will help you in describing the exposure, the nature of the exposure. Sorry, should have also mentioned this. So describing the location of the receptor and also describing the location of the hazard. So as I've said, in under a near-term future, under scenario 1, the location hazard might be in a particular area. So for example, if wildfires are occurring in a particular smaller area, under different terms and under different scenarios, so under a long-term future, under a high scenario, that location of where that wildfire might be occurring might be it much more expansed or might be slightly adjusted, but that's why we kind of separate these out. We then, based on the location of the receptor and the location of the hazard, we can then describe the level of exposure against that particular climate-related hazard under that particular scenario, under that time frame. So what is helpful when you're conducting this exercise is to flick between action 3 template and action 4 and 5 template. So we get a sense of, okay, under the near term, under that scenario, what does that future look like? When we move on to the different timeframes, we can compare that with, okay, well, under a medium term, what does scenario 1 look like? We can then compare these figures and look at that trajectory and what that climate hazard might be, how that climate hazard might be developing. We do this exercise, so once we've described the level of exposure and the nature of exposure, we can assign an exposure rating. That will automatically generate an impact rating. We can then look at the likelihood of that hazard occurring and those and the impact occurring based on the chosen methodology. There are a few ways of doing this, but it would be I'd recommend it's aligned to your national climate risk assessment approach, because there are different geographies who use different approaches. But you can explore the potential climate-related hazards future, explore the nature of the impact and the magnitude of that impact, and assign a likelihood rating. This will automatically generate a risk rating for that particular scenario under that particular time frame. We would then complete that exercise for scenario 2 under the near term, for scenario 1 under the medium term, for scenario 2 under the medium term, scenario 1 under the long term, and scenario 2 under the long term. This, depending on the nature of the risk, or depending on the nature of the kind of impact and receptor and hazard, it might feel a bit repetitive, but as you're doing this exercise, it's again building that understanding of how it might change over the future scenarios. And that will help you with identifying what action you can take and the scale of that action and the kind of the impetus of that action. So for example, there might be an increasing risk. It might be a low risk rating in a near term, but quite a high risk rating in a future term under a particular scenario. If we just look at the near term, or if we just take that low risk rating as face value, we're not fully conceptually understanding all potential futures. The second to last tab, I should say, is just emphasizing about communicating uncertainty. And again, when we engage with the information relating to hazards, or we engage in information that relate to kind of very conceptual things such as sensitivity or vulnerability, etc., we need to embrace the uncertainty that might come with that. And we are going with kind of putting our best foot forward, selecting the best information that we can access at that time within our resource, and making our best judgments on what to do about those. The final tab is just a source for further information, and it includes a number of links, to the missions portal or to MIP4ADAPT platform, just where you can access further information about all of these. Okay, I have been speaking quite a lot, so apologies, and I hope you're still with me. But I just wanted to go back and re-demonstrate very quickly what this exercise looks like with some practical examples. And the example that I have chosen just for the benefit of today is I was lucky enough to visit the region of Blekinge in the summer with the mission, one of the conferences, and had a wonderful time. And so I've chosen Blekinge as the source of the information for the example that I'm going to show you now. This is purely what I was able to gain off of the internet. I personally have not done any stakeholder engagement to complete this exercise. It's very poor practice from me, I know, but hopefully you don't mind just for this instance to demonstrate. So if I was completing this for the agricultural sector, I might be concerned about how crops might respond to a particular climate hazard, and I've chosen wheat. I might be concerned about how that how crops are sensitive to heavy precipitation changes in that region. I would then explore the particular receptor, being crops, and try and describe that sensitivity. So here I've just said wheat is sensitive to changes in precipitation, but the nature of its response is specific to the type. Some are highly tolerant with little yield change, some experience increases in yield. That could be an identified opportunity. I would then, based on that rating, I would then assign a sensitivity, sorry, based on that description, I would then assign a sensitivity rating. Looking at adaptive capacity, I would then think on what are the organisations or the available capacity within that region. And I've said that they are well engaged with agriculture in the region and to support crop farmers. I then think about the technical capacity and could describe that local crop farmers know which wheat variants are more resistant to heavy precipitation in their area. Then thinking on the financial capacity, I might say, or might understand through means of stakeholder engagement, well, actually, local crop farmers do not have the financial resources to enact that change. And then finally, the ecosystem capacity, I might describe that the local ecosystem can withstand heavy precipitation to a limit, but flooding may occur, which may prevent farmers from realising benefits from high precipitation. I can then review across those components of adaptive capacity the qualitative descriptions and assign a rating. Once I do this, you can see that there is an automatic rating generated for vulnerability. Okay, then quickly moving to the next template, which is inputting information about the climate-related hazards. So I've chosen heavy precipitation for this example. So I'm going to include that there. And then I've gained this information through the World Bank Climate Knowledge Portal, and it did have the granularity for Blekinge. So I've taken the values for the average largest one-day precipitation in millimeters. Then, based on the values in those projections, I was able to gain this information. So that is taking the 2030 as a midpoint just for the purpose of this exercise. Under scenario 1 being I've chosen SSP2, and under scenario 2 being SSP5. And I've input those values there. Then moving to the final input tab, you can see that some information has already been automatically carried across. And that just then requires me to engage on the location of the receptor, location of the hazards, and exposure and likelihood. So for the qualitative description of the receptor, I've said that it is located throughout the region. You could identify specific locations, but I'm afraid I don't have that information for particular crops in Blekinge at this point. I would then qualitatively describe the location of the relevant hazard, and based on the size of the region and based on the nature of the hazard, I've just described that it is occurring throughout the region, as there are no particular geographic discrepancies for that particular hazard. I would then describe the exposure of that receptor, of the crops, to heavy precipitation under that time frame and scenario. And I've just said that it is highly exposed to heavy precipitation, given the nature of the asset being crops and its exposure to local weather and overall local climate. I can then assign a exposure level there, which would then interact automatically with the vulnerability rating to generate this impact rating. I would then, based on the review of the trajectory of that particular hazard and potentially the scenarios that I've chosen, the likelihood of those scenarios, the likelihood of the components of the impacts remaining the same, or based on the process that you would prefer to use for the methodology of understanding likelihood, you can then input the likelihood rating to here. And I have, okay. And then if I put in 4, it automatically generates a risk rating at the end. So that would be risk rating of 4 under the near time for scenario 1. And a risk rating of 4, if we just go back to this tab, describes it as low to medium impact, high to very high likelihood, or high to very high impact and medium to high likelihood. Doing this process, understanding where the risks are, understanding the level of risk, can really help us to prioritize amongst those risks as well. I'm afraid my Excel has frozen, but if I was to complete that exercise for all of the scenarios, all of the timeframes, on all of the receptors, for the sectors, for hazards, you then build out a picture of which areas to prioritize. So you might have a real breadth of risk rating, some very low, some very high. Doesn't mean they're not all important. It just means that you can prioritize where your efforts and energies can go. I will stop there because I think I'm just about over time and we need to go back to some slider questions. So yes, just to bookend that, apologies if I've moved very quickly, but all of the information is in the tabs in the Excel, and there are supporting resources all throughout. So thanks for bearing with me, and yeah, hope that you are able to kind of get something out of this.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think it was a clear presentation, and we got already some positive feedback in the chat. Before we got already some questions as well. So before I go, or I read the questions out to you, we have a short Slido question to the participants. So it's the same, basically the same link. We can start with the first question, please. So for those of you who have done a risk assessment, and for those who are ahead of it, the question is, what do you see as a main challenge? This is an important question for us because this will help us to develop this tool further and probably also the guidance further. So please type in your comments here. Quite interesting, yes. So it's all about judgments and how to get rid of subjectivity. And I have to say there is also there are a couple of questions already related to that in the chat, but also in the question and answer. And while people are typing, Claire, maybe you want to reflect on the on the first question related to the tool. How can you document in this tool the information that you have used and the sources of the assessment? I think this is something to be separated, but as you have developed it.
Sorry, just to clarify, the question is how to document sources of information.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right there, Thomas. It's best to document that in a separate either document or Excel or repository of the nature, or whatever suits you. That is basically because if we're comparing a region with very low capacity for conducting a CRA and comparing a region with very high capacity for conducting a CRA, the level of information, the level of sources, the type of sources, everything could be very different. So I'm seeing some, questions come up about subjectivity and judgment and things like that. There is a range of there's a range of ability or range of scales that you could imagine the completion of a CRA is on. So at the very one end of that scale is kind of a low capacity, high level assessment. You might only, assess vulnerabilities and do a very kind of quick pass approach. The level of detail that you would go into is not that high, or the number of sources and the type of sources might be very small. But that's not to say that that's not a useful exercise, because you are still identifying really high top level priority, or top kind of skimming that top of what do we really need to consider when it comes to vulnerabilities. If you did that exercise, if you did a very high level pass at this, where you feel like there might have been, you might have had to rely on on opinion from stakeholders. That range of stakeholders might be small, but it can help you to communicate that there's a need to do further work, or it can help you to communicate that, we've done to your particular regional, governance authority, or to a national authority. We've begun this process of completing a CRA. We've identified these high-level things, but we're experiencing a lack of data, or we're experiencing, we don't have enough resources to engage the right experts or academics or industry professionals to give us their expert judgment or expert information on the details. You might then be able to gain support to then go back to your CRA and build that information up. On the complete other end of that scale is, as I've said, a really high capacity region with loads of resources and access to data and things like that. That's where you can reduce that subjectivity, because you can use different sources and use different sources to identify different indicators of the particular components, identifying indicators of adaptive capacity or vulnerability or exposure. And then you have much more specific kind of signposts or data points to pull from, for example, percentage of population in a region exposed to a particular hazard. And that reduces that subjectivity. But I want you to try and keep it in mind that the completion of a CRA is on a scale, and it's not that one end is good and one end is bad. They just generate different things and can help you in different ways.
Yeah. I think the other really important point, and you said it as well, is that you take the time of having this documentary, because you are not doing a risk assessment just once. You have to repeat it every year, and then you can compare to the assumption that you have had 5-6 years ago. And that is also relating to the question that came up, how can this subjective element be ruled out to some or reduced? And I think you gave the answer with referring also to the stakeholder involvement and making sure that it's not a single person that's doing the judgments, that you have discussions around it. So anything to add here? Yeah.
No, completely agree. Exactly that. It's really important that stakeholder engagement, where there might be elements of subjectivity that you're concerned about. Discussing it with key experts, with key stakeholders, with key community representatives, helps you build a picture. And once you do that, it's never a situation where people fundamentally disagree about an element of this. There are different perspectives, and that builds a realistic picture of what you're experiencing. But I'd also just, the one thing to add to that is that we shouldn't be too scared of not basing it entirely, but don't be too scared of integrating perspective on this. If you were in a workshop environment trying to understand vulnerability to particular hazards, you might have representatives from the private sector, you might have representatives from government, but you also might have representatives from community organizations, for example, elderly groups. Their perspective and their kind of quote unquote subjective experience of a particular climate hazard is really valuable as well, if they feel that they don't have access to certain things, or if they feel that their sensitivity to a particular experience is being overlooked, then we should embrace it, essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I mean, my experience with this kind of work is also, it's that carrying out such an exercise is also a capacity building element as well. Because in particular, the level of information is quite different across the different stakeholders, or even within the same stakeholder group. And the climate risk assessment can really be used in order to increase the level and generate a more common level of understanding of issues. And then, as you said, you probably are getting a more harmonized picture anyway when the level of understanding or knowledge is a similar one. A good question is also, how can you assess opportunities with this tool? It's because there are still some regions that, at least in the medium term, might profit from climate change.
Yeah. So we tend to think about climate risk assessments as something purely negative and identifying the bad. It's not the case. As I kind of I alluded to a little bit in that example I was just giving for Blekinge, is that when researching on, you know, a particular sector and a particular asset or receptor within that sector, being crops, and conducting that research, and in my case that was just desk-based, but in reality it would be a combination of all these things. I could understand that, okay, well, there's evidence has been shown that actually an increase in heavy precipitation has increased yield of particular crops. Now that can be identified as an opportunity, and through the template, it's still going to come out as, you know, if they are highly sensitive and you have high adaptive capacity, it might be a low vulnerability, but you've done that exercise. You can extract that yourself and identify, make sure that that's an opportunity. Or you can complete the exercise and you've identified elements being as particularly high risk. But by completing the exercise, you've picked out particular details that demonstrate to you that, okay, well, this is high risk now, but in this process, we've already discussed, well, actually, that's the experience now, but we know that we can do that, or we know that there's a particular action plan or strategy or policy that's going to come in place that's going to change the nature of things, so that an opportunity is there to be had. So partially, yes, you can identify it specifically within this, and you can identify areas of low vulnerability or areas of, you know, low vulnerability, high vulnerability, low exposure. Those will tell you some things and be able to tell you kind of where there's opportunity, if there's an opportunity. But the importance of this process is doing the process itself, is engaging with that information, because you end up finding out what we thought was a risk is actually an opportunity. What we thought was heavy precipitation is going to potentially harm our agricultural abilities. Actually, through that process, we found out it might increase it, or there's evidence to show that it might increase it. Therefore, we take action to, building on that as an opportunity itself, treating it as an opportunity and not a risk.
Yeah, thank you. Another question is, how long does it typically take to carry out such an assessment? I mean, I think it's depending on the size of the region, but the question is referring here to 2 million inhabitant regions for all sectors, which is a bit difficult to judge because we know that can be between 5 and 86 sectors, depending on the region and how you are structured. But it's not something you do in one day normally. So
No,
yeah,
no, just to agree with you there, Thomas. It's really dependent on the scope of the assessment that you're covering and the
yeah,
detail at which you're going to, the number of stakeholders you might need to identify. But
yeah,
yeah, it's not something you do in a day, it's not something you do in a week. I think if you're struggling with time as a resource for completing the CRA, I would think about it as a circular process or an
yeah,
ongoing process. So if you're struggling with time and you don't have that external support, it might take you, if it takes a longer time because you've had to come back to it, or because if you spread that time burden over a longer period, it might take longer, but you might be able to, you might be able to do more with less, if that makes sense.
yeah. And I mean, this is also my experience that we often have started with the main sectors, which are of the highest economic interest or with the highest vulnerability areas in terms of geographical areas, because the past event has informed us already about what the impacts are. And then with the cycle approach you described, then you start diversifying the sectors, you start diversifying the population, and you start, okay, we look at the elder ones, we look at the kids, and this kind of thing. Yeah. And I mean, this is also my experience over the last 20 years in adaptation, that we started from water management, and now it has really become an issue for all societal sectors, aspects, whatever. So it's not a process you should do once. It's really, as you said, you can refine it, and you have to rework it anyway with new information, or in order to judge how your adaptation actions have managed to reduce the risk, for example. Yeah. Okay, we have one more question. It's about the budget. I think it's a bit like with related to the size. It's depending on how much you can do in-house and how much external help you need. In the lunchtimes, we will present you in the future a lot of data sources you might be able to use, but because that is also something which can save you money. And as Claire also mentioned, most member states have a lot of information ready. It's just connecting to them and getting this information for your region organized. Yeah. There is a question on, I'm not fully sure, if you were to introduce more rigor to the tool, what would you add? Possible standards, metrics, scientific evidence basis to the tool to support decision making and ensure that there are more objective measures guiding the rating process. So I think this is a bit of a scientific question.
Yeah, I think, and it's a really interesting question as well, actually, because I think with the understanding of the concepts, components, sorry. So so for example, when assessing sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure, I think introducing a more rigorous process for them looks like introducing more specific indicators of those as variables and things that you could potentially gain through academic research. Like you could identify those you could establish indicators and identify the information against those indicators through a more like rigorous academic approach. That would take a much longer time, and it's a much different exercise. If we again thinking about that scale of one end to the other on what to complete a CRA on, or how to complete one. And then in the ratings, one of the ways which we insert in some kind of larger CRA support that we've provided is through the stakeholder engagement. We introduce an approach called the Delphi method, which is just it's purely just a 3-step engagement approach, which when you do, you make a first pass of the ratings, and then you engage with information, you make a first pass of the ratings with stakeholders. Those stakeholders then engage with each other across different sectors or different groups, or however the engagement has been constructed. They engage with each other in a much more dynamic way. They then come back and rate again. And then the third step, which I've done before, is that there is a period of time of kind of reflection. And then in the next time that we've engaged them, we've asked them to rate for a final time. If you were doing a more of an academic approach, it works very well, and it does increase that rigor. When you're doing that approach for public or authorities, agencies, governments, it works, but they don't have as much time to engage with this kind of information, or they're spread thin across a number of different issues, and this is just one of them. So it does work. It's just it's less it can be less it can kind of put people off in some ways it really depends what environment you're conducting the CRA in. As I said, if you wanted to increase the rigor, identifying indicators and doing some research to establish some values for those indicators of things, and introducing certain kind of formal processes such as Delphi. But it depends on who the beneficiaries are of that CRA.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my experience is in particular in smaller regions or smaller communities, a more scientific approach does not necessarily lead to different results. It's showing the same direction. It's probably, and I have to say, after the vulnerability assessment, I've seen very often politics coming in and putting the focus on other things that are coming out of the vulnerability assessment. As we are close to the end, we have one more question for the people online. Maria, can you please go to the next poll? Do you think, as a direct feedback to Claire, do you think the presentation was clear? Yes or no? So at least 7 people think yes, 10 people think yes. Okay, we are having 20, so most people are happy. At least, no, 1/3 is happy. You can still vote while still no one is complaining, so that's very good. Another thing, if you are going to use the tool and you think that improvements are needed, please come back to us. We are really happy to take that on board and discuss with you what needs to be improved. Because I mean, this tool has been developed on the experience by mainly Claire, Richard, and myself, and but we are not the end users very often. So please take into consideration when you use it that the feedback to us is really something important to improve the tool further. I think we have one more question in the poll. Yeah, question is, do you think you will use it? Yes or no? If you say no, we are also fine with it because there's several more tools out there. Or you said, oh, this is so complex, we are going to outsource that to a team that is doing that for us, and we just pay for it, which I've seen quite often. But on the other side, if you do it on your own, you are increasing also your knowledge about the region and how things are connected to between the sectors very often, which is good for the next steps as well, when you start identifying adaptation options and probably are implementing them. Because I can assure you that the discussion around adaptive capacity is a discussion that you will repeat when selecting measures and implementing measures. Okay, thank you so much. There is a last, I hope I can share my slides now. There is a, yeah. There is, why doesn't it work? Yeah, you see, okay. Not sure what you see, but this is a QR code where you can send us feedback on the whole presentation. It will also be sent out with the thank you email. The next lunchtime is going to be on the 15th of February at 12:30, and we will discuss monitoring indicators to measure output and progress in your adaptation process. So we are jumping from step 2 of the RAS to the step 6. But just as a reminder, the information will be out tomorrow. But maybe if you're interested, block your dates on the 15th of February. Many thanks to you, Claire, for this really excellent presentation and keeping the time. Thanks to Maria and Michi for the technical support, and thanks to all of you making sure that climate change is not hitting us that hard, hopefully, in Europe. Thank you, and see you again, hopefully in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.